was a quiet town, nestled deep in the woods. It wasn't on any major road, and most people passed by without ever knowing it existed. The townsfolk liked it that way. Life moved slowly here, and that was just how they liked it. I had arrived in Windridge a month ago, tired of the chaos of city life and looking for peace and quiet. The town was small but charming, with an old general store, a few houses, and a local diner. People were friendly, and everyone seemed to know each other. At first, everything seemed perfect, but as the days passed, something felt wrong. It was subtle at first, a cold chill that would hit me whenever I walked by the old church, the sound of whispers carried on the wind, or the way the sky seemed to darken earlier than it should. The people in town were nice, but there was always a certain distance. I never felt fully welcome. They smiled at me, but their smiles never reached their eyes. It was like they were waiting for something. It was the older woman at the diner who first mentioned it. Her name was Mrs. Patterson, and she had been in Windridge her whole life. I had gotten into the habit of stopping by the diner every morning for coffee and breakfast. One morning, as I sipped my coffee, she leaned across the counter, her voice low and serious. "You're new around here, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah, just moved in about a month ago. It's a nice place." "Peaceful." She nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "You're not the first one to think so," she said softly, her eyes flicking toward the window where the town's main street was empty. "But there's something you should know about Windridge. Not everything is as it seems." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes hardened, and she quickly glanced around the diner to make sure no one was listening. "There's a curse on this town," she whispered. "It's been here for as long as anyone can remember. Every few years someone new comes and they think they can escape the past, but no one ever does. The past always catches up with them." "Curses?" I chuckled, not sure whether she was joking. "You're not serious, are you?" She gave me a long, searching look. "It's not something you'll understand until it's too late, but don't say I didn't warn you." Her words stayed with me as I left the diner and walked back to my small house on the outskirts of town. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the empty streets. There was a heaviness in the air, something I couldn't quite explain. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice more strange things. The town, while friendly, felt oddly empty. People came and went, but there were never any new faces. It was as if the population remained the same, no matter how many houses were for sale or how many people moved away. I became friends with Tom, a local who worked at the general store. One evening, as we shared a beer at the diner, I asked him about the curse Mrs. Patterson had mentioned. "Don't listen to her," Tom said, laughing nervously. "She's old and likes to tell stories. It's just the way things are here. Windridge doesn't attract many outsiders. We keep to ourselves." "But what about the disappearances?" I pressed. "I've heard rumors." Tom stiffened. "There's been a few, yes, but people leave towns like this all the time. It's nothing strange." I wasn't convinced. I decided to look into it. I went to the local library the next day and started asking around. The librarian, a thin woman named Mrs. Miller, didn't seem surprised by my questions. She simply led me to a dusty shelf in the back of the library and pulled down a thick book. "This town has a long history," she said, flipping through the yellowed pages. "You'll find it all in here." The book was full of old newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. There were mentions of strange events going back hundreds of years, all tied to Windridge. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read through the pages. Disappearances, strange noises in the woods, and rumors of something dark living in the town's past. And then I found it, the story of the first disappearance, which occurred over 100 years ago. A young woman named Evelyn had vanished without a trace. There was no explanation, no body. She had simply disappeared, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. I shivered and closed the book. "What happened to her?" I asked Mrs. Miller, but she only shook her head. "Some things are better left unanswered," she said, her voice quiet. "The town's past is complicated. If you value your peace, it's best not to dig too deep." It was a week later when I decided to go out into the woods. The town had always seemed peaceful, but something about the forest unsettled me. It was vast and dark, the trees so thick that sunlight barely filtered through. Local stories spoke of strange happenings in the woods, disorienting noises, disappearing paths, and shadowy figures watching from the trees. I had to see for myself. I walked for hours, following the narrow trail that led deeper into the forest. The further I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. It was as if the world had stopped moving. I felt a growing sense of unease, but I pressed on. The air was damp, and the wind had a strange, unnatural chill to it. Then, I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from just beyond the trees. I stopped, my heart racing. The voice was soft at first, almost like a breath. But as I strained my ears, the words became clearer. "Leave this place." I froze, looking around. There was no one, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I took a few more steps, but the whisper grew louder. "Leave, or you'll be next." I turned and ran. My legs were heavy, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly, and I couldn't see the trail anymore. The trees seemed to close in on me, their shadows reaching out like hands. I stumbled and fell, scraping my knees, but I didn't stop. Finally, I broke through the trees and stumbled into the open field. I looked back, but the woods were silent again. No whispers, no shadows, just the stillness of the forest. But I knew it was there. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the whisper in the woods, the warnings, and the strange events I had witnessed since moving to Windridge. Something wasn't right. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had become a part of something I didn't understand. I went to the diner the next morning, my mind racing. I needed answers. I sat down at the counter and asked Mrs. Patterson again about the curse. Her expression didn't change. "You're beginning to understand, aren't you?" she said quietly. "Windridge has a way of pulling people in. It's been doing this for centuries." I didn't understand what she meant, but I wasn't going to let it go. I had to know. And so, the more I dug into Windridge's past, the more I uncovered. It wasn't just disappearances. It was something much darker. A pact, a curse, a force tied to the very land the town was built on. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and it was waiting for the next person to fall into its grip. The town had a way of drawing people in, newcomers like me, and then it wouldn't let them go. I couldn't stay in Windridge any longer. I knew what I had to do, but leaving wasn't as simple as packing my things and driving away. The town wouldn't let me. The town didn't let anyone leave. That night, I packed my car and drove down the empty road, heading for the nearest highway. But as I drove, I noticed something strange. The road was winding. It was as if I had passed this same spot before. I turned around, but the road behind me was empty. There were no turnoffs, no signs. I was stuck, and that's when I understood. Windridge had claimed me, and now it wouldn't let me go. Clearwater wasn't on most maps. It was a small town tucked away in a valley, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to stretch forever. The air always smelled like damp earth and pine, and a mist clung to the ground, even in the middle of... I had never heard of the town until I inherited a house there. The letter came out of nowhere, a legal notice stating that my great-uncle Arthur, someone I had never met, had left his house to me in his will. It felt strange, but I was between jobs and thought it might be a good idea to check it out. It was lonely. The closer I got, the fewer cars I saw on the road. By the time I reached the town, the sun was starting to set, and the mist seemed thicker. The welcome sign was old and weathered, the paint peeling off. "Welcome to Compilation 482. I drove down it was almost deserted. A few shops lined the road, a diner, a hardware store, and a grocery store. A couple of people stood outside the diner, staring at my car as I passed. Their gazes felt heavy, like they were trying to figure out if I belonged. The house was on the outskirts of town, at the end of a gravel road that cut through the woods. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw it, an old, two-story Victorian house with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dark, and the whole place looked like it had been abandoned for years. I stepped out of the car and stared at it for a while, unsure if I had made a mistake coming here. Inside of dust and mildew, the floorboards creaked under my weight, and cobwebs hung in the corners. There was no electricity, so I used a flashlight to explore. The furniture was old and covered in white sheets, and the wallpaper was peeling off in long strips. In the living room, I found a photo of my great-uncle Arthur. He was a tall man with sharp features, wearing a stern expression. Something about his eyes made me uneasy, like he was watching me even from the photograph. The kitchen was worse. The sink was full of stagnant water, and the walls were stained yellow, A strange symbol had been carved into the wooden table, but it was so faded I couldn't make out what it was. Upstairs, the bedrooms were empty, except for an old wardrobe and a rocking chair that creaked when I touched it. The master bedroom had a single item on the dresser, a journal. I sat on the bed and opened the journal. The handwriting was messy and hard to read, but I could make out some of it. The whispers started again last night. They come from the woods, calling my name. I know better than to go out there, but it's hard to ignore them. It's not natural. It moves like it's alive, creeping closer to the house every night. I've boarded up the windows, but I don't know how long I can hold out. If someone knows that Clearwater is cursed, don't trust the townsfolk, don't stay after dark, and whatever you do, don't go into the woods. The entries stopped. The last date was from 2 months ago. I closed the journal and felt a chill run down my spine. Something about the words felt real, too real to be dismissed as paranormal. The next day, I decided to explore the town. The diner seemed like a good place to start. Inside, a few people sat at the counter, sipping coffee and talking in hushed tones. When I walked in, the conversation stopped, and everyone turned to look at me. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with graying hair, smiled politely, but didn't say much as she poured my coffee. I tried to ask her about my great-uncle, but her smile faded. Arthur was a private man, she said, glancing toward the door. He didn't mix much with folks around here. An older man sitting at the counter leaned over and whispered, "Best you don't stick around too long, miss. Clearwater isn't a place for outsiders." Before I could ask what he meant, the door to the diner opened, and a cold gust of air blew in. Everyone fell silent again as a tall man in a sheriff's uniform walked in. His eyes were sharp, and his expression was unreadable. "You must be of the old Harlow place," he said, his voice deep and steady. I nodded. "I'm Emma. I'm just here to—" "You'll want to keep to yourself," he interrupted, "and stay out of the woods." With that, he tipped his hat and walked back out, leaving a heavy silence behind him. That night, I tried to settle into the house, but sleep didn't come easily. The journal's warnings echoed in my mind, and every creak of the old floorboards made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it, the faintest sound, like whispers carried on the wind. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. It wasn't the wind. The whispers were soft but distinct, almost like a conversation. Curiosity. I grabbed my flashlight and crept downstairs, careful to avoid the creakiest steps. The whispers grew louder as I approached the back door, which led to the overgrown backyard, and beyond that, the woods. When I opened, the stopped. The mist outside was thicker than ever, curling around the trees like pale fingers. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but it didn't penetrate far. The woods loomed just beyond the edge of the yard, their black silhouettes swaying gently in the breeze. "Hello?" I called, immediately regretting it. No. I stayed there for a moment, heart pounding, before slamming the door shut and locking it. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to know. The next morning, I went into town again, determined to get answers. The diner seemed like the best place to start. The same waitress was there, and this time, I pressed her for information. "Look," I said, leaning over the counter. "Something's not right about this town. I heard whispers last night, and there's this fog that doesn't seem normal. What's going on here?" She glanced around, leaning in. "You should leave," she whispered, "before it's too late." Too late for... Before she could answer, the door opened, and the sheriff walked in again. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see a flicker of something in his expression, concern, or maybe anger. "Miss Harlow," he said, his voice steady. A word outside. I followed, stepping into the chilly morning air. "This town has rules," he said, his tone low. "Stay out of the woods, don't wander at night, and don't go asking questions about things you don't understand. You'd do well to pack up and leave." "What are you all so afraid of?" I asked, frustration creeping into my voice. He didn't answer. Instead, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving me with more questions than before. I couldn't ignore it any longer. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself standing at the edge of the woods. The journal's warnings rang in my ears, but so did the whispers I had heard the night before. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was animals or the wind playing tricks on me. But something deeper, something primal, told me to stay away. And yet, trees. The air grew colder as I moved deeper into the forest. The fog wrapped around my ankles, making it hard to see the ground. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Then, I heard it again. The whispers. They were louder now, almost like voices, but I couldn't make out the words. My flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging me into darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. I turned to run, me shifted, and I stumbled. The fog thickened, making it hard to see or breathe. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a shadow, tall and spindly, its limbs unnaturally long. I scrambled, branches clawing at my skin as I stumbled through the trees. The growl grew louder, closer, and I could feel something chasing me. Out of the woods, the house was in sight. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and collapsing against it, gasping for breath. The next day, I went back to the diner, determined to get answers. The waitress wasn't there, but the older man who had warned me before was sitting at the counter. "You went into the woods, didn't you?" he asked without looking at me. How did... Everyone does, eventually, he said, his voice heavy with regret. "It's the town. It ... See alls to you. The fog, the whispers, the shadows. They're all part of it." "What is it?" Voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, his eyes haunted. "The town is cursed, has been for generations. No one knows how it started, but once you're here you can't leave. The fog keeps you in, and the woods, well, you've seen them." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "That's not possible. I can leave whenever I..." "Can you?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't answer. I couldn't stay in Clearwater any longer. That night, I packed a small bag, grabbed my car keys, and headed for the highway. The older man's warning echoed in my mind. "Can you leave?" The mist was thicker than ever, swirling around my car as I drove down the gravel road toward the main street. The headlights barely cut through the fog, and the road seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways I didn't remember. When I finally reached the highway, relief washed over me. The open road stretched out ahead, and for the first time in days, I felt free. But as I drove, something strange happened. The road kept leading back to Clearwater. I side road, hoping to bypass the town, but the mist only grew denser. My GPS stopped working, and the trees seemed to close in around me. After what felt like hours of driving in circles, I found myself back at the town's weathered welcome sign. "Welcome to Clearwater, population 482. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I parked the car and stared at the sign, my heart pounding. It wasn't possible. But it was. The next morning, I confronted the older man at the diner. "How do I get out of here?" I demanded. He shook his head. "You can't. None of us can. The fog keeps us in, and the woods keep us scared. That's the way." "There has to be a way," I said, my voice rising. He hesitated, then leaned in closer. "The woods are the key. Whatever's out there, it's what holds the town in its grip. But no one who goes deep enough ever comes." I didn't want to believe him, but I didn't have a choice. If the woods were the source of the curse, then I had to face them. That evening, I prepared for the journey. I packed water, food, a flashlight, and the journal I had found in the house. Before stepping into the woods, I stood at the edge, staring into the dark. "I'll come back," I whispered to myself, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. At first, they were incoherent, but soon they began to form words. "Emma, why did you..." I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" I called. The forest answered with laughter, soft, mocking, and all around me. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat. The trees twisted and warped, their branches forming strange shapes that resembled faces. Eventually, I came to a clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, its roots sprawling across the ground like veins. The air was heavy, and the fog seemed to emanate from the tree itself, curling upward like smoke. As I approached, the whispers grew deafening. Shadows danced around the tree, and I felt a presence, something watching me. "Wait." The journal's final entry flashed through my mind. The fog is alive. It's part of... What do you want? I shouted into the... The shadows converged, forming a shape, tall, spindly, and inhuman. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its voice echoed in my mind. You are mine. I realized then what my great-uncle must have known. The tree, the fog, and the shadows were all connected. Whatever this thing was, it fed on fear, on people's inability to leave. I remembered the symbol carved into the table in the house. It was a protective mark, I was sure of it. My uncle had been fighting this thing, trying to stop it. I reached into my bag and pulled out the journal. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a small weathered knife with strange symbols etched into the blade. The creature lunged at me, but I slashed at it with the knife. It recoiled, screaming, and the fog began to dissipate. I didn't stop. I stabbed the knife into the tree, and the ground shook. The shadows writhed and screamed as the tree's bark split open, releasing a blinding light. When I woke up, I was lying on the forest floor. The fog was gone, and the woods were... I stumbled back to town, expecting to find everything the same. But Clearwater was different. The oppressive feeling was gone, and the townsfolk looked free. You did it, the older man said when he saw me. The curse is... I didn't stay to celebrate. I packed my things, got in my car, and drove away. This time, the road led out of Clearwater. As I left, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The welcome sign was still there, but the population had changed. Welcome to Clearwater, population 0. When my car broke down just outside Briarwood, it felt like a bad dream. The engine sputtered and died, and no amount of turning the key brought it back to life. The highway was empty, and the nearest sign of life was a small wooden sign that read, Welcome to Briarwood, population 932. I had town before, but it was the only option. I grabbed my bag and started walking. The trees pressed close on either side of the road, their branches twisting like skeletal hands. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and the air smelled like rain. By the time I reached the town, the streets were eerily quiet. The buildings looked old, their paint faded and peeling. I spotted a gas station and stepped inside, hoping to find a mechanic. The man behind the counter barely looked up when I entered. His face was pale, his eye... Car trouble? He asked. Yeah, I said. It's a couple miles back on the highway. He nodded slowly. Jake's garage is down the road, but you might want to think twice about staying here. I frowned. Why is that? He didn't answer. Instead, he slid a set of keys across the counter. Take the spare room at the Briarwood Inn, but keep your curtains closed at night. The inn was as unsettling as the rest of the town. The front desk was unmanned, but a note with my name sat on the room 3, upstairs. I didn't remember telling anyone my name. The room was small but clean, with a single bed and a window overlooking the main street. I pulled the curtains closed, as the man at the gas station had suggested, and tried to relax. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my window. I froze, listening. The steps were slow and deliberate, as if someone were pacing back and forth. Summoning my courage, I peeked through the curtain. The street was empty. But when I looked down, I saw footprints in the dirt, large barefoot prints that seemed to lead directly to my window before vanishing. The next morning, I walked to Jake's garage. The mechanic, a burly man with grease-stained hands, agreed to tow my car into town. How long will it take to fix? I asked. Couple of days, he said, not meeting my eyes. Stay out of trouble while you're here. As I wandered through the town, I noticed something odd. Every door and window had thick iron bars, and most of the buildings seemed abandoned. The few people I saw avoided eye contact, hurrying away as I passed. At the diner, an older woman named Mary served me coffee. She seemed friendlier than the other. You're not from around here, she said. No, just passing through. What's going on in this town? She hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear. There's with Briarwood, she whispered. At night you might see him. Don't look. Who? I asked. She shook her head. Just don't look. If you hear the knocking, stay quiet. Pretend you're not home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Mary's warning had unsettled me, and every creak of the old inn made my nerves worse. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic knock at the front door downstairs. I held my breath, listening. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. Against my better judgment, I crept to the top of the stairs and looked down. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I could see a tall figure standing on the porch. The figure didn't move, except to knock. My heart pounded. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Slowly, I backed away and returned to my room, locking the door behind me. The knocking continued for hours, long after I had buried myself under the cover. The next morning, the knocking was gone, but the footprints remained. They were large and barefoot, just like the ones I had seen outside my window. I confronted Mary. "Who is he?" I asked. Her hands shook as she poured my coffee. "We call him the Stranger. He's been here longer than anyone can remember. Some say he's cursed, others think he's something else. But he only comes for those who don't babble. Why doesn't anyone stop him?" She laughed bitterly. "You can't stop him. You can only hope he passes you by." By the third night, I was too terrified to sleep. I kept the lights on and sat by the window, watching the street below. Around midnight, the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was at my window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knocking was soft but deliberate, like someone tapping with their knuckles. Slowly, I reached for the curtains, parting them just enough to see outside. A face stared back at me, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a wide, unnatural grin. The Stranger. I stumbled back, tripping over the chair and landing hard on the floor. The knocking stopped, but I could still feel his eyes on me, even through the closed curtain. The next morning, I decided to leave Briarwood, car or no car. I packed my bag and walked out of the inn, heading for the highway. As I passed the gas station, the man from my first day stepped outside. You can't leave," he said. "Watch me." He shook his head sadly. "It doesn't matter how far you go. He'll follow you. He always..." I ignored him and kept walking, my heart pounding with every step. When I reached the highway, I felt a strange sense of relief. The road stretched out before me, empty and inviting. But as I started walking, the air grew colder. And then I heard it. The knock. I turned around, and there he was, the Stranger, standing in the middle of the road. His grin was wider than ever, his hollow eyes fixed. I ran. The knocking followed, faster and louder, until it was all I could hear. My legs burned, and my breath came in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, he was always there. Collapsed, too exhausted to go any farther, the Stranger loomed over me, his grin stretching impossibly wide. "You don't belong," he whispered. When I woke up, I was back in Briarwood, lying in the middle of the main street. The townsfolk stood around me, their faces pale and expressionless. "You can't leave," Mary said softly. "None of us." Now I know the truth. Briarwood isn't just a town, it's a trap, and the Stranger is its warden. And I'm his newest prisoner.